She was 34 years old, and she had $19 to her name, a wagon with one bad wheel, and nowhere on this earth she could call home. It was her husband's own brother, Silas Mercer, who put her out of the farmhouse she had scrubbed and loved for 12 years, standing in the doorway with the county paper in his hand and telling her that the law did not care what a woman had built with her own two hands, only whose name was written on the deed. She had $19, a milk cow, and a grandfather's old pocket watch that would not sell for enough to matter. And so, when she heard that a bankrupt traveling menagerie was dispersing its stock at the old Bellwether rail pens outside of Thistle Creek, Kansas, she walked 3 miles in the dust to look. And for every last coin she owned, she bought 19 buffalo, starved, moth-eaten, ribs like barrel stays, animals so pitiful that the auctioneer laughed before he took her money. The whole town would laugh with him before the season was through. They did not know, and she did not know either, not yet, that inside those animals, in the very ground they would paw and kneel upon, lay something sealed away for 20 years that would turn her ashes into green pasture and give an entire drought-broken community back its life. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Ada Mercer. If you have ever been told that what you carry is worthless, only for time to prove otherwise, tell us where you are watching from tonight. Ada had been born Ada Vance in the spring of 1859 on a homestead so far out on the Kansas prairie that her mother used to say the wind knew their names before the neighbors did. Her father farmed wheat and buried two infant sons before Ada arrived, healthy and squalling, and so she grew up as the only child of a man who treated her, from the time she could walk, as the son he had been given instead of the one he had lost. It was not her father, though, who shaped the deepest part of her. It was her grandfather, Jeremiah Vance, a lean and silent man who had come west in his youth as a hide hunter, one of the men who rode out onto the great buffalo ranges of the southern plains and left them littered with bones. He did not speak of those years easily, and when he did, it was never with pride. Ada remembered sitting at his knee on winter evenings while he mended harness leather, and she remembered the one story he told more than any other, how he had once seen a cow buffalo dig at the same patch of hardpan for 3 straight days in a drought summer, pawing and kneeling and grinding her great head into the dirt, until on the fourth day water came up black and cold from the ground, and every creature within 20 miles seemed to know it before nightfall. Buffalo, her grandfather told her, did not merely eat the prairie, they remade it. Their wallows caught the rain that would otherwise run off and be lost. Their hooves broke the crust that choked the deep-rooted grasses so those roots could breathe. Where cattle stripped a range bare and left it to blow away as dust, buffalo left it richer than they found it if a person only knew how to read what they were doing. He believed, in his last years, that he owed the prairie a debt for what he had helped take from it, and he spent his final seasons quietly studying the animals he had once slaughtered by the thousand, filling a leather-bound journal with sketches of wallows and notes on grass and water that he showed to almost no one. Ada was one of the few. She used to think it was simply an old man's guilt talking. She did not yet understand that he was handing her, without either of them knowing it, the exact knowledge that would save her one day. Her grandfather died when she was 16, and something in him seemed to pass directly into her hands, because from that year on, she was the one who could gentle a spooked horse, doctor a sick calf, and coax a garden out of soil everyone else had given up on. She married Thomas Mercer at 20, a steady, quiet-spoken man who ran cattle on a modest homestead outside Thistle Creek, and for 12 years theirs was a marriage built less on romance than on partnership, two people who worked from before light to after dark and were grateful, at the end of most days, simply to sit together on the porch and watch the sun go down over land they had built into something worth having. They had no children who lived past their first winters, a grief Ada carried quietly and never let harden into bitterness. And when neighbors asked her how she bore it, she would only say that the land itself had become a kind of child to her, something she tended and worried over and took joy in watching grow. She learned every acre of that homestead the way another woman might learn the face of a husband. She knew where the grass came in first after a wet spring and where it always came in last. She knew which draws held moisture longest in a dry year. She did not know then that this quiet, unglamorous knowledge, the patient reading of land and weather and root and hoof, was the very inheritance her grandfather had left her, more valuable by far than any deed or dollar, and that a day was coming when it would be the only thing standing between her town and ruin. There was a particular evening, the autumn before Thomas died, that Ada would return to often in the years afterward. though at the time it had seemed like nothing more than an ordinary supper. Thomas had come in from mending fence to find her at the kitchen table with her grandfather's journal open before her, and rather than teasing her the way another husband might have for dwelling on an old man's fancies, he had sat down across from her and asked in his quiet way whether she believed any of it was true, whether a beast the whole world had decided to kill off could really know something about this land that no living rancher did. Ada had told him that she did not know, only that her grandfather had never once lied to her about anything else in his life, and that a man who spent his last strength trying to make amends for a wrong he had done seemed to her a poor candidate for foolishness. Thomas had nodded slowly, in the manner of a practical man setting a strange idea carefully aside rather than dismissing it, and said that if she ever had the chance to test her grandfather's notion, she ought to take it because a woman who could read land the way she could ought never to let anyone talk her out of trusting her own eyes. She had not thought of those words again for nearly 2 years. She would think of them almost daily once 19 starving buffalo came into her keeping. Thomas Mercer died in the November of 1892, thrown from a Greenbroke horse and dead within the hour, and Ada buried him on a hill overlooking the home he had built, believing in her grief that at least the ground beneath her feet was safe, that whatever else she had lost, she still had the place where her whole married life had happened. She did not yet know that Thomas, trusting his brother the way men sometimes trust blood over paper, had never formally transferred the homestead claim into both their names, and that under the law, as Silas Mercer chose to read it, and had a county clerk friendly enough to read it his way too, the land passed to the eldest Mercer brother and not to the widow who had worked it for 12 years. Silas came within the month, sorrowful voiced and full of talk about family duty, and told Ada that he would, of course, see she was not put out onto the road with nothing, that he was a Christian man. What he gave her was $19, the milk cow, the wagon, and 30 days to be gone. Ada did not beg him. She had watched her grandfather bear a heavier weight than this without breaking, and something in her simply set itself quietly and permanently against ever giving Silas Mercer the satisfaction of seeing her fall apart in front of him. She packed what little was hers, drove the wagon into Thistle Creek, and took a room above the mercantile that she paid for by scrubbing its floors. And for the better part of a year, she did whatever honest work a widow with steady hands could find, mending, nursing, breaking horses for men too proud to admit a woman did it better than they could. The whole while, the drought that had been creeping over the plains since the spring of 1893 tightened its grip a little further every month, turning the grass brown, then gray, then to nothing at all. And every rancher in the county watched his cattle grow thinner and his creek beds turn to cracked clay, and said the prayers men say when they have run out of anything better to do. It was in the dead heart of that drought summer, in July of 1894. That word came through Thistle Creek of a traveling Wild West menagerie stranded and bankrupt at the old Bellwether rail pens 6 miles south, its owner having skipped town owing wages and feed bills both, leaving behind a scattering of broken down show stock to be sold for whatever it would bring. Ada walked out to see it more from idle curiosity than intention, and what she found in those pens broke something loose in her chest that she had not expected. 19 buffaloes stood crowded in a corral built for a quarter, that number, animals that had once, she supposed, been meant to thrill town crowds with their wildness, and were now reduced to walking racks of bone, their coats patched and dull, their eyes dull too, in a way that made several onlookers mutter that the kindest thing would be to shoot the lot of them where they stood. The auctioneer, a red-faced man eager to be rid of the whole business, took one look at Ada's plain black morning dress and her wagon and laughed outright when she asked the price, telling her nobody in their right mind wanted 19 half-dead buffalo in the middle of the worst drought Kansas had seen in a decade, that she could have the whole miserable lot for what she had in her purse and be doing him a favor. Ada had $19 left to her name. She handed over every one of them, $1 a head, while the men around her shook their heads, and one called out that a fool and her money were soon parted, and she did not answer him because she was already looking at the animals themselves, not the joke everyone else saw, but the very creatures her grandfather had spent his last years trying to understand, standing in front of her as though summoned. She drove those 19 buffalo the 6 miles back toward Thistle Creek on foot, walking behind a hired mule cart with feed she could not really afford, and settled them on the last scrap of ground that was truly hers, a rocky, played out 40 acres at the edge of town that nobody had wanted even before the drought land so poor it had passed through 3 owners in 10 years and been abandoned outright by the last, who left behind only a sagging line fence and an old dry stock tank. It was, everyone agreed, the one plot of earth in the county, even less promising than the animals now grazing what little grass grew on it. Ada moved into the leaning line shack that stood on the property, patched its roof herself, and set about the starving buffalo back from the edge of death with a devotion that made the town's laughter sharpen rather than soften. Within the first week, she noticed what her grandfather's journal, which she had kept wrapped in oilcloth in her trunk since his death and had not opened in years, had once described to her as a girl. The buffalo did not graze evenly across the ground the way cattle did. They moved in patterns, returning again and again to certain low places, kneeling and rolling and grinding their great heads into the dirt until shallow bowls formed in the earth, exactly as her grandfather had once told her at his knee. One old cow, in particular, scarred along one flank and clearly the leader of what remained of the herd, worked at a single depression near the northeast corner of the property with a single-mindedness that seemed almost unnatural for an animal so weak, pawing at the same spot morning after morning, even as Ada tried to coax her toward better grass. It was that stubborn old cow's wallow, more than anything else, that would change everything that followed. Though in that first week, Ada took it only as strange behavior in an animal too starved to know better, and went back to the harder, more immediate work of keeping 19 skeletal creatures alive through a Kansas drought with almost no money left to buy them feed. It was in the third week, while Ada was digging out that same stubborn wallow herself with a spade, hoping to widen it into a proper catchment for the rare rain that occasionally spat down without ever truly breaking the drought, that her spade struck something that was not stone. She knelt in the dirt and worked it free with her bare hands and found a rusted tin dispatch box, its lid sealed with wax gone, brittle and split, buried perhaps 2 feet down in ground that she would later work out had been open on fenced range 30 years before, back when her grandfather Jeremiah Vance had ridden this very stretch of prairie as a young hide hunter turning penitent. Inside the box, wrapped in oiled canvas that had kept out most of the damp, she found a second, smaller version of the very journal she already owned, along with a hand-drawn map marked in her grandfather's unmistakable, cramped hand, showing this exact 40 acres, this exact low corner of ground, with a small cross inked over the spot where she now knelt, and a single line beneath it that made her sit back on her heels in the dust and read it 3 times over. Here, the old bull found water in the drought year of 64, and where the bull finds it once, the herd will find it again, for the ground does not forget. Ada Mercer, 35 years old, penniless, mocked, and kneeling in a wallow dug by a dying buffalo on the one piece of land nobody else in Kansas had wanted, understood in that moment that she was holding something far larger than a curiosity from her dead grandfather's grief. She was holding a map back to her own survival, left for her, though he could never have known it 20 years before she would need it. Ada did not tell a soul in Thistle Creek what she had found, not at first, because she understood well enough by then how quickly a woman alone could be parted from anything valuable once the wrong men learned she had it. She spent the following weeks reading and rereading her grandfather's 2 journals side by side, cross-referencing his sketches of the old buffalo ranges with the shape of her own land and coming slowly to understand the fuller shape of what he had pieced together in his last years. Jeremiah Vance had not merely noted that buffalo could find water. He had documented patch of ground by patch of ground across a dozen seasons, how the animals' wallows collected and held the scant rains that cattle-cropped, plow-broken land simply shed and lost, how their grazing pattern, eating hard in one place and moving on entirely, rather than stripping a whole range evenly bare the way cattle did, left the deep-rooted native grasses time to recover between bites, so that ground grazed by buffalo through even a hard year came out the other side of a drought greener than ground grazed by cattle, sometimes strikingly so. He believed, and had written it plainly in a hand-grown shaky near the end, that the plains would not truly heal from what the hide hunters like himself had done to them until buffalo were allowed to return to at least some small corner of the ground they had shaped for 10,000 years, and that any rancher wise enough to let a small herd work a piece of exhausted land instead of fighting them off, it would find in time pasture where his neighbors found only dust. Ada realized, turning the pages by lamplight in the leaning line shack that was now the only roof she owned, that she had not made a fool's purchase at all. She had, without knowing it, bought the one tool in the entire drought-stricken county capable of doing what no amount of prayer or well digging had managed for anyone else, and she had bought it for $19 on the very ground her grandfather had marked as certain to hold water when every other acre for miles around went dry. Through that August, the drought worsened until the county newspaper stopped pretending otherwise, printing reports of dry wells as far as Larned and ranchers driving gaunt cattle to railheads at half their worth rather than watch them die on the range. Ada kept working her wallow at the northeast corner, widening and deepening it exactly as her grandfather's notes advised, lining its lowest point with the flat creek stones she hauled up from the dry bed a half mile off so that whatever water came would be held rather than soaked instantly back into thirsty ground. She kept her buffalo moving in the slow, deliberate patterns her grandfather had described, letting them work one section of the 40 acres hard for a matter of days before moving them off to rest, rather than penning them to graze any one spot to nothing the way the town's cattlemen pen their own dying herds. The change came slowly enough that for weeks it looked like nothing more than a starving woman's stubbornness, but by early September, even the boys who rode out from town to jeer at Ada Mercer and her worthless buffalo herd had begun to notice something none of them could quite explain. On land that had been abandoned as the poorest 40 acres in the county, grass was coming up green in low, shallow bowls scattered across the property, exactly where the buffalo had worked, while every pasture around it for miles lay the color of ash. The stubborn old cow's original wallow, the one where Ada had unearthed her grandfather's box, had by then filled with enough water after two thin September rains to reflect the sky, a small, dark mirror of moisture sitting in ground that should, by every rule of that terrible summer, have been bone dry. And it was that pond, more than anything Ada said or did, that finally made the whole town of Thistle Creek stop laughing and start paying very close attention indeed. It was Silas Mercer who paid the closest attention of all, and not out of any brotherly gladness at his widowed sister-in-law's good fortune. Silas had, in the 2 years since he put Ada out, quietly consolidated 3 more homesteads under his name through the same generous readings of the law that had served him with Thomas's land, and he had his eye on buying up whatever else the drought forced out of failing hands before the rains, whenever they came, drove land prices back up. He rode out to the old Bellwether Pens property himself that September, saw the green low ground and the standing water with his own eyes, and returned to town, telling anyone who would listen that Ada Mercer must have struck some hidden spring by pure blind luck, that it was an accident of geology and nothing more, and that the sensible thing, the Christian thing even, would be for the family to take the property back into proper hands before a woman alone ruined whatever value it now held through mismanagement. He made her an offer for the 40 acres that was, on its face, generous for land that had been worthless a season before. And when Ada refused it, politely but with a steadiness that startled him, Silas began instead to work the town itself against her, reminding the cattlemen whose herds were dying by the dozen that a woman was out there hoarding water on land that some still argued on old and disputed boundary grounds belonged rightfully to family and not to a widow, and suggesting, in the careful way of a man who never quite says the cruel thing outright, that perhaps the county ought to look into whether Ada Mercer's buffalo, eating grass and drinking water that the rest of the range so desperately needed, were even legal to keep it all. A handful of ranchers, frightened enough by dying stock and dry wells to grasp at any grievance, began to mutter that the buffalo ought to be driven off or shot, that one woman had no right to green pasture while everyone else watched their herds starve. Ada felt that turning of the town's mood most sharply on the Sunday. A group of boys rode out and put down her fence in 2 places for the sport of watching her buffalo scatter across the road. And though no one owned to the mischief afterward, she understood well enough whose whispered grievances had put the notion into young heads in the first place. She mended the fence herself before nightfall, alone, without asking a soul for help, and told Ezra Holt when he came by the following morning to see if she needed anything that she did not intend to give Silas Mercer or anyone else the satisfaction of watching her ask for protection. She was fully capable of providing herself. It was around this same time that Ada began to understand just how carefully Silas had been working the county behind her back, using the same quiet, reasonable voice he had used the day he put her out of her own home, telling the county clerk over coffee that perhaps a widow alone had no business holding land that plainly held some mineral or water, right, worth disputing, and telling the minister after Sunday service that he worried for Ada's soul, hoarding good fortune while Christian neighbors suffered. None of it was said loudly enough to be answered directly, and that Ada came to realize was precisely the design of it. A slow poisoning of opinion that left no single remark for her to challenge, only a general and hardening sense around town that something about her sudden good luck did not sit right. It was Ada's neighbor, a widower named Ezra Holt, who ran what remained of a modest herd on the section adjoining hers, who first came to her not with threats but with a hard, searching question, standing at her fence line in the low autumn light and asking her plainly whether what people were saying was true, that she had found some spring and meant to keep the good of it entirely to herself while the rest of them went under. Ada could have lied. She could have let the town go on believing in blind luck a while longer, the way Silas wanted them to, and quietly bought up more drought-broken land herself once she was established, the way any sensible woman looking only to secure her own future might have done after everything that had been taken from her. Instead, she brought Ezra Holt into the line shack and showed him her grandfather's two journals and the buried box and the map with its small inked cross, and told him the whole truth of what 19 dying buffalo, bought for $19, had turned up out of ground everybody else had already given up on. She told him what her grandfather had believed in his last years, that the buffalo could heal what the hide hunters and the plow both had broken, if only somebody had the patience to let them work. And then she told Ezra Holt what she meant to do with it, which was not to hoard the knowledge as her own fortune, but to prove it publicly on ground the whole town could walk out and see for themselves, and to teach any rancher willing to learn how a small herd worked with patience, not against the land but alongside it, might bring back grass and water where cattle alone had brought only dust. Word of Ada's offer spread through Thistle Creek faster than Silas Mercer could get ahead of it, and by the first week of October, with a drought showing no sign of breaking, and 3 more wells gone dry on the western edge of the county, a delegation of ranchers came out to the old Bellwether property themselves to see the green ground and the standing water with their own eyes rather than take either Silas's word or the town gossip for it. What they found was a woman in a patched dress and worn boots who walked them across her 40 acres and showed them patiently and without a trace of the triumph she might easily have claimed exactly what her grandfather's journals had taught her: the shallow catch basins the buffalo dug and how they held what rain there was, the deep-rooted grasses left standing to recover under a grazing pattern that moved rather than lingered, the old cow's original wallow now grown into a pond deep enough that Ada had, in the weeks since, begun hauling water from it by barrel to help 2 of her nearest neighbors keep the remaining stock alive through the worst of the month. It was that quiet act of sharing, more than any speech she might have given about her grandfather's guilt or her own hard year, that turned the tide of the town's opinion decisively in her favor, because a woman hoarding a lucky spring was one thing to resent, and a woman hauling water to a dying man's cattle without being asked was a different thing entirely to a county that had watched its own charity run thin under the drought. Silas Mercer, watching his careful campaign against his sister-in-law collapse in the space of a single afternoon, made the mistake that finally undid him, riding out to the delegation himself and declaring loudly in front of Ezra Holt and half a dozen other witnesses that the whole discovery rightfully belonged to the Mercer family, regardless of whose name sat on the deed, since it was, after all, Thomas Mercer's brother's blood that ran in the family that had once owned the land where the old buffalo hunter's box was found. It was an old rancher named Pruitt, one of the men who had laughed loudest at Ada's purchase back in July, who asked Silas the question that unraveled him entirely, wanting to know exactly how Silas came to know so precisely where on the property the box had been buried, when Ada herself had only just described its exact location to the delegation minutes before. Silas had no good answer, because the true answer was that he had known of Jeremiah Vance's late life obsession with the old buffalo ranges for years, had in fact once found and read a portion of the old man's notes among Thomas's effects after the funeral, had understood enough of what they hinted at to guess there might be value buried in ground nobody wanted, and had said nothing to Ada at all when he put her off the homestead with $19, choosing instead to let her walk away from whatever her grandfather might have left behind, so that he alone might one day quietly claim it. The truth of it came out of him in stammering, red faced pieces there in front of the whole delegation. And the same county that had laughed at Ada Mercer's 19 Buffalo turned its cold attention on Silas Mercer instead. Ezra Holt saying flatly that a man who would starve his own brother's widow rather than share a hunch about buried value was no kind of Christian at all, whatever he called himself in church on Sundays. What followed was not the storybook reversal of fortune that leaves one family rich and another ruined, because that was never the restoration Ada Mercer had set her heart on. She had, by the time the drought finally broke in the wet spring of 1895, taught a dozen neighboring ranchers her grandfather's patient methods of letting buffalo or even carefully rotated cattle work a depleted range back toward health rather than stripping it bare, and had sold or loaned young stock from her growing herd, now numbering better than 30 head, to any family in the county willing to try it on their own worst ground. Ezra Holt's section grazed the same careful way through that following year, came back greener than anyone but Ada had believed possible, and by the second season, 3 more ranches had turned over their poorest, most exhausted acres to the same slow, patient method rather than fight it any longer. As for Silas, the county's own quiet justice proved more thorough than any court could have managed, because the same delegation that had turned on him for his silence now made certain that the disputed boundary questions he had used to trouble other widows and heirs across the county were finally properly examined, and Ada's original homestead, the land she and Thomas had built together for 12 years, was returned to her outright the following spring under a corrected deed, not through Ada's demand, but through neighbors who had come to trust her enough to see the old wrong righted without being asked. Silas Mercer did not go to prison and did not lose everything he owned, because Ada never once asked for vengeance in all the months this played out, only for the truth to be known and the ground, at last, to be shared as fairly as her grandfather had always believed it ought to be. He simply became, from that season forward, a man whose word carried no weight in Thistle Creek, watching from the edge of every gathering, while the widow he had once put out with $19 became the one neighbor's rode miles to ask for advice. We began this story by telling you that Ada Mercer was 34 years old with $19 and nowhere to call home, and that she spent every last coin she had on 19 Buffalo. So pitiful, the whole town laughed at her for it. We told you something was sealed inside those animals and the ground they knelt upon that would restore not just one widow's fortune, but an entire drought-broken community. And now, it was never gold or silver at all, but a kind of knowledge the world had thrown away. Twice over first, when the hide hunters, like her own grandfather, nearly wiped the buffalo from the plains, and second, when a county assumed a herd of starved, worthless-looking animals could hold nothing of value for anyone. Ada never once used what she found to make herself the richest woman in the county, though she could have. She used it to teach Ezra Holt's ground to hold water again, to put a corrected deed back in her own name, not through anger, but through earned trust, and to prove quietly and without ever raising her voice against the man who wronged her, that what looks like ruin to everyone else can be the exact shape of your restoration, if only you are patient enough and humble enough to kneel down in the dirt and look closely at what everybody else already decided to laugh at and walk away from. Thank you for spending this time with Ada Mercer and the 19 Buffalo nobody else wanted. If her story moved you, we would be grateful if you shared it with someone who needs to hear that overlooked things are not always worthless things. And we would love to know in the comments below of a time in your own life when you found real value in something everyone else had already written off. Until next time, stay close.